Hello, I'm Rich Lee, and welcome back to the Hall Institute Forum. Our guest today is Jerry Aumente, a professor emeritus at Rutgers University, a journalist, and the author of From Ink on Paper to the Internet, a book about New Jersey newspaper history. Jerry, can you tell us a little bit about this book, its origins? I know you worked with the New Jersey Press Association on the project.
Well, the New Jersey Press Association in the year 2007 was celebrating its 150th anniversary, the oldest continuing press association in the United States. John O'Brien, who is the executive director, asked if I would consider doing a book about the history of the newspapers of the state. So I said yes, but I wanted to do more than just an overall history. I wanted to look at what was happening in terms of new media technologies, especially the internet, how it was affecting the survival of the papers, and how do they reinvent themselves. So the book is sort of like two books. On one track, it's the history with some really wonderful stories about major people in the national media and in the local and regional media. And the other story is the story of the technology and how newspapers are probably facing their most crucial existence right now and their survival. And it seemed to work because at the time we were thinking of, well, I interviewed all of the editors and publishers around the state and in the region, and I asked them to think in a time frame of 10 years out, 30 years out. We since have found, the book came out in 2007, 2008. It won the SPJ award. But basically, my timeline was too long. There's a real crisis in the newspaper industry in New Jersey and nationally and internationally right now, mainly because the internet is like an asteroid that just slammed into the whole media landscape and is changing the whole face of not only print but radio and television and everything else. So that's really the theme running through the book.
Yeah, and definitely even right here in New Jersey we're seeing a lot of what you talked about happening. A lot of times New Jersey is somewhat of a bellwether state. Things happen here before they happen elsewhere. But let's go back maybe to the early days. How long ago did newspapers start in New Jersey? It wasn't even before the Revolutionary War. We had some sort of
there were some pamphlets that were hung in the taverns, for instance.
Yeah.
But the real first formal newspapers came during the Revolutionary War, and it was interesting in that New Jersey and Delaware were two of the colonies that didn't have their own weekly papers. The governor of New Jersey convinced the legislature at the request of George Washington that we needed a paper in New Jersey, so one was started in Trenton. And that basically, in that period of the Revolutionary War, was the first weekly paper. And then there was a gradual increase in the number of papers, and to the point where New Jersey became really one of the highest density, not only highest density states, but the highest density of weekly and daily papers in the country, partly because it didn't have its own television.
Right.
I mean, it had some very good public TV with NJN, but basically had no commercial television licensed in the state, so that this was a field day for the newspapers. And so you get a concentration here that you don't see in other parts of the country.
Yeah. As you looked at New Jersey newspaper history, did you see like trends or different eras, or was there a steady evolution, or were there kind of benchmarks along the way as to what happened?
Yeah, they were basically newspapers didn't have a glorious start. They were primarily people who owned a print shop and were doing job work, and then they needed to do something else, and they started doing these weekly papers. But the whole history as it evolves, I was fortunate in being able to find the original records going back to the early and mid-19th century, where the New Jersey Press Association was basically trying to evolve as a profession. The issues of ethics, what should you do and not do if you're owning a newspaper, how vigorous should you be in doing investigative reporting. I mean, I've got a number of stories where, in the case of the Record, for instance, in Hackensack, New Jersey, the publisher of that paper at one point was so threatened by people in organized crime who didn't like the exposés he was doing that the whole family was under protection. The publisher had a submachine gun in his office plus 3 other guns. There was another case of a publisher down the shore, the Asbury Park Press, who was told by one of the local townspeople that, we don't like the coverage, so don't come to the meetings anymore. He showed up at one of the meetings, put a gun on the table, and said, I'm here to cover the story, and if anybody has a problem, let me know. So we have that kind of Wild West thing happening. But at the
was that typical, and was that happening in other parts of the country?
Well, I'm sure. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
I'm sure. As a matter of fact, we did have. Well, there was one killing of an editor who was at his desk where somebody came in and didn't like the coverage, and it's a tough way to do criticism.
Yes.
But basically, the whole newspaper industry was very rowdy in the early 19th century. Mm-hmm. It was very partisan. It was tied to parties. It was tied to, in some cases, religious beliefs. But it was a place where people were really rolling up their sleeves and taking a swing at each other with words. It evolved into a much more serious kind of situation as a mass medium developed. And now we take it up to the point, it survived radio, it survived television, and then suddenly it comes to the Internet, and the Internet is not just one more medium coming along. Mm-hmm. The Internet is basically the hand connecting all of the pieces, and then at some point, the Internet is just chopping it down. I mean, we're in the middle of, as you know, some really major economic changes, buyouts, people disappearing from newspapers right now.
So, okay, well, that's really a perfect segue because we're about ready for a break. But when we come back, I want to talk about what the Internet is doing to the media, not only in New Jersey but across the country. So we'll be back soon. Thanks.